Hello, here we are, episode 4, conversation about race, and today I'm chatting to Lorraine Lee. Hello, Lorraine.
Hi there. Hi, Billy. Hi,
We,
everyone.
we've been friends for, 25 years plus?
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly well older than our oldest child, who is 20. So it's
And
a
listen,
long time.
and it's true to say we have never talked about race
That's right.
in that time.
Shocking as that is, that's absolutely right. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so probably that's part of our conversation today as to why that is, So,
Yes.
so tell us a bit about your background, growing up, etc. Where have you lived and
Okay.
how was life for
Okay,
you growing
cool.
up?
Yeah. So my parents are both Jamaican, from Kingston in Jamaica. They met in England. And I was born in Greater Manchester and raised really in that massive kind of immigrant community that was in Manchester at the time. So probably most of the people around me at that time would have been black and would have been in little family units. And I grew up in a massive high-rise block of flats, which actually, Billy, when I went back to try and see them as an adult, they'd actually been demolished because they were basically unsuitable for people to live in. They were a terrible, terrible place. So, loads of things about being fearful, coming up stairwells, lifts always broke. It just awful stuff, smelly, no light. It's just all of that stuff that now you just couldn't make buildings like that, but everybody was kind of stuffed and crowbarred into those types of buildings. So that's really our background. And then as we kind of got older, we slightly moved further and further away, if you see what I mean, because obviously the ticket to move forward then was basically finance, education and finance.
Yeah.
That's the deal. And probably it's why so many people from ethnic groups, and certainly in the West Indian community, really, really plug education massively with their kids.
So at what point did you begin to experience any sort of racism?
So I would say primary school was okay. There were just little bits of, people not wanting to play with you, but I never remember it being bigger than anything that was happening to anybody else. So, just kind of like the mean stuff in the playground and that kind of thing. What I do remember is really enjoying learning. I really liked it. I was interested, really curious, and all of that was kind of fine at primary school. But when I went to secondary school, massive change then with a adolescent population. So the first thing that I noticed was that there was probably me and 2 other black children in the entire school. So I was the only one who had black parents on both sides. So in colour of skin, I was the darkest person. So that was where I was first called coon and chalky, and where teachers, very interestingly, the PE teacher used to call me names, and the PE teacher really, really didn't like me, which was really interesting because I was brilliant at sport.
Yeah.
And I think what it was is that she felt that others were displaced and she didn't like that. So she would regularly call me derogatory names, regularly. And even though I was winning a huge number of things for the school, that was a regular experience with her, which was quite challenging. And also the other thing that came into play there was that teachers didn't expect me to be interested in learning. Right. They were like, oh, wow. They were surprised. They were, I was kind of, they just didn't think that I would be able to do well. I was just an anomaly. They expected me to be kind of really delinquent, not interested, difficult to manage. And I just wasn't. So but I remember knowing that they found that uncomfortable and difficult. And I remember feeling that they don't want to be kind to me. They don't want to be nice to me, but my behavior is not giving them a reason to not be. That was so secondary school. I began to realize a lot of things at that point, both from the staff and from the children. And in fact, I had one really close friend, and her dad was black and her mum was white, and we kind of stuck ourselves together.
Right. So then you got involved in church at some point in your adolescence, teenage years. How was that experience for you? You know, did you experience anything there, or was that a positive experience? Or
Right. Well, this was really, really interesting, and I think is really key in the moment in time we find ourselves in globally about race. So, as I said, where we lived, it was basically a immigrant community, colossal number of people in terrible housing, and then right at the kind of the bottom of the main sort of furrow way where all the houses, the flats were on one side, right at the bottom was a little evangelical church. And this evangelical church was full of old people, lots and lots of really old white ladies.
Yeah.
And I remember so much, and this is where this is the pieces of hope that I have, that actually a heart can change irrespective of what packaging it's in. So you would expect an older person to find it more difficult. You would expect older ladies maybe to be threatened by lots of, you know, black youths, which is what we had experienced, so what we expected, but they weren't at all. They really, really loved us. That was my first experience of church. And because I had discovered that I was a runner, and because there was nowhere to run at home, when I went into the big hall at church, I would just run around. I would just run around and around and around the perimeter of the hall. And at some point they'd just say, Lorraine, please come and sit down. But everything they taught me, I can remember. That is where I learned how to tithe, how to be generous. Every single principle that are sort of core principles I learned in that church before the age of 11, and I can remember them. And obviously when I got older, I tried to find some of those people and to say to them, you did a brilliant job, I want you to know I'm still going on, you know, but most of them had actually died. But I get goosebumps even thinking about them, because they were so counterculture. They did something that seems almost impossible. Yeah. And the key thing is they were not afraid. Didn't see in them at all, it's really choking me up actually, any fear. They were not afraid of us. They didn't have packaging that said that we were a threat. They had none of that. And because of that, you had these, they were probably 60 years old and 15-year-old black guys conversing and, you know, doing parades and, you know, coming to Christ and all of that kind of stuff. But it's because they were not afraid. That was the central piece.
So then as an adult, then obviously you met Steve. He's a white guy.
Yeah.
I mean, any that we need to hear about your adult experience pre-children?
Yes. Okay, so that's a little bit different then. So as an adult then, I mean, from that point onwards, really, you know, I was a Christian, so I was in different types of churches, never really had any sort of terrible experiences there, but generally did note that all of the positions were white generally and male generally, exclusively actually. So my thinking started to be around kind of representation. There's no representation there. And so obviously, you know, Steve met, married, and when we were first married and didn't have children, I would travel with Steve a lot when he spoke at other churches. And sometimes, you know, people would just do a double take, and because they weren't not necessarily any black people in those churches, what would happen is I'd arrive, and if I didn't actually go in physically with Steve, they'd think, well, she must be a visitor because there's no one else here who's black. And then if you say I'm with Steve, they're trying to think of a black Steve. They're trying to think, well, who could it be? Because there's nobody else in the church who looks like you. And people actually were quite, oh, Steve, yeah, it's Steve Lee, the one who's speaking. Yeah, the one who's speaking. The person who's speaking, yes, that is my husband. And we've had similar kind of feels with the children as well, who have actually found it, they moved from finding it funny to finding it a little bit offensive, that it was just such a complicated thought pattern that we were with Steve Lee. So we've had quite a lot of that in church, I would say, where, you know, we stand out, one thing, but also we're not associated with anybody who's white. We're visitors on our own, is how we are sort of welcomed.
Yeah. So scroll forward then 20 odd years, and you've got 3 kids now.
Yeah.
I know you've been having some conversation with them recently about
Yeah.
their experiences.
Yeah.
So how has that been for them? Have things changed, improved, got worse as you've listened to them?
So this is probably an area of a lot of current pain, Billy, because we really believed that with some of the changes, so in music, in fashion, in sport, in cosmetics even. So when I was young, that you could not go into any shop except in the West Indian Centre and get any form of makeup, hair product, anything at all. Nothing at all. I remember being really upset that people would say, this is skin colour. And I'd be thinking, but whose skin? Because actually it's like a pale sort of pinky colour. It's not skin colour at all, unless you're white. And even then it's a bit dodgy. But there was certainly, you know, nude tights, all of that kind of stuff. I just remember thinking, but because those things seemed like they were getting better, I assumed that the vocabulary of young people and their expression was just wholesale changing and improving. And I think probably for, you know, hundreds of thousands and millions of young people, that has happened. But within those groups, there are still some terrible comments. And Steve and I have been kind of brought to tears by some of the things that our children have revealed that they've actually told us for the first time in terms of racial harassment and derogatory treatment that they have had. And what's really interesting is that the people who have said those things to them kind of refuse and block the pushback. So if you say, actually, I don't like being called that, which they have said, or, you know, that's not cool, please don't do that again. There's just a pushback. There's not an acceptance that, well, okay, this person doesn't like it, I'll step back. There's a pushback. And that's what's really, really surprised me. There's a sense of, well, you will accept this because I feel it's fine to say it.
Wow.
So that has been difficult, very, very difficult.
So obviously this moment is upon us, and one of the comments that someone said to me was, I hope there's a response, not just a reaction.
Yes.
So what would you want to say to me, to us, to other white leaders, say about how we respond in this moment?
Okay, so I've probably got a couple of things, if that's okay, Billy, that I would say here, just based on everything that's happened, what our children have said. You know, I've had all the racial profiling. I've been followed in a shop. I've had a shop have to apologize and give free stuff because they agreed that that's what they had done. You know, I've had all of that kind of stuff happen. And I think what's happened is myself and hundreds of people in the Black community have got to a point where they now feel I can no longer withstand things to make someone feel comfortable or to not make someone feel bad. I now have to say, because by being able to take it on board and not make a fuss, nothing has changed. Not enough has changed if my teenage children are still having racial comments to their face, which they cannot seem to be able to block and, you know, and have them sort of retracted. So because of that, it means that I'm going to be much more forward, if you like, with things that are not right and not reasonable, where I would have just observed them before. So one morning, very soon after George Floyd had been murdered, I kind of got in the shower and put on a YouTube video about, you know, kind of starting your day with God. It was that kind of thing. And basically, I watched it, and it was the story behind it was amazing. It was all of these different situations. If you are, you know, if you're a young person, if you're a parent, if you're a business person, if you're in work, if you've suffered loss, all of these different scenarios, this is how you can sort of, you know, start your day with God. The message was superb. But I tell you what, Billy, if you'd have been watching that as a black person, all of these images of people, you would have come away from that and you'd have thought two things. God is great, but he's not for me. Because not one person in any of the images from a church, a whole compilation, was anybody who wasn't white. Not one person. Not one person. And that is trying to encourage people on this journey of faith. And it was just devastating, because the message was so great, but it was so limited, you know, in its approach. So what I would say is, stay connected to this conversation. People are going to get annoyed and hassled, and they're going to want you to stop talking about it long before anything has actually happened and changed. We're going to want to go back to the general things that we talk about in church, and we're going to want to move it away from race. But for black people, at that point, nothing will have changed. People will have just got bored with hearing it. So I really want to encourage people, stay in the conversation. We're talking about hundreds of years of oppression. You can't get bored with that in 3 months. You know, that's just a ridiculous response. So the things that are coming from the church already are, the big one, all lives matter. So I just want to address that comment, all lives matter. So if all lives matter, which they do, then there is no problem with the statement Black Lives Matter, because that is a subsection of all lives matter. So there's no offense in the statement, all lives matter, therefore Black Lives Matter must be true. It only is a problem if the word only is inserted. If we say only Black Lives Matter, then it's a problem, and it's no longer attached to all lives matter. So I'd really like to try and get rid of this as being presented as two things in opposition to each other, because they're actually not. And the reason it has to be said is because no one will forget that white lives matter. No one will forget that. But many people over hundreds of years have forgotten that Black people are people and that they matter. And that's why the slogan is necessary. Because people, in their behavior, in their employment, in their remuneration, all of that, they forget. And that's why it needs to be there. So that's the first thing, to make sure we have a proper stance to that comment. The second one is, I'm not racist. So I'm not racist, therefore, you know, and no one in this church is, so let's just move on. Come on, let's go. So I would like to try and move that argument on and to agree with most people. Yes, you're not. But therefore, what are you going to do about it? I don't think we need to argue with them and push that back and say, well, you did this and you said this. Let's just agree. No, you're not. But therefore, what does that mean in your actions? If you are not, what would that look like? What would you actually do? Not what kind of cerebral conversation would you have, but what would you actually do? So that those two things are the things that are bobbing up already. All lives matter and I'm not racist. And I think we need to have a proper sort of closing defense against those things. And then the last thing, Billy, I would say to yourself and church leaders is, please, could you just look at all of your visuals, every single one. Every single one. Anything that promotes a toddler group, promotes alpha, promotes anything where you are looking to reach out to people, and you will be shocked at how much of that is white, exclusively white. And the reason I think this is so important is because people very often use stock images for that. And because all the stock images need to be generally white, when you go to look for images of Black people, they're hardly there. It takes ages. And that's because we haven't created the supply and demand. So I would love to see church leaders, when they have, you know, brochures and literatures and promos developed, pushing things back to the people who have developed them and say, I don't want that. It's not diverse. They're all white. You've given me all white images. I don't want that. Because as soon as we begin to push that back, then that person has to go find some other images, and then we can get a demand system going whereby people are now taking those pictures because people want to see them, and it has become the norm. So if you put that lens on, you will be so surprised at how much imagery is exclusively white. And I think as church, we can't afford to have that, because we're giving the message that God is good, but he's not for you. And that's an appalling message to be giving. So stay in the conversation, deal with those two objections, and make sure that if somebody was just to look, they could see themselves in something that the church is actually showing.
Yeah. Lorraine, thank you. That's fantastic.
You're very welcome.
So good to hear your thoughts, and I'm sure you've got a lot more to contribute on this issue as well. So thanks again.
Yeah, no, thank you for the opportunity, Billy. I know it's probably not easy for you, but I do think it's incredibly important, because every Black person, no matter how easy or difficult you think they are to get on with, every single one of them has experienced racism on multiple times, including myself. So even someone hearing that, I'm sure there'll be people who'll think, I'm really surprised Lorraine's experienced racism, but I have, and you've given me a chance to be able to say that, which is great. So thank you.
Thank you. See you soon.
All right, see you soon, Billy. Bye.